If I might have your attention, please. Good afternoon, and welcome to the continuing series of lecture education, question and answer. This afternoon, we're very privileged to have a friend of mine who I met in 1992 on the Orchard hillside in a tent in the rain. He's written books called Man-Made Life in 1982, anticipating this thing we now call genetic engineering by several years. He has been the director of the Heritage Seed Library in England, where you were allowed to borrow seed in order to get around the European seed laws. And we all know if you borrow, you always do what? Bring it back, certainly. Yes. Without further ado, Jeremy Cherfas.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. It certainly was quite an occasion meeting Keith. It was a mosquito-infested field back up there, and he was inside a mesh tent with a cooler full of beer. And I was outside the mesh tent with a thirst. And somehow we managed to negotiate swatting the mosquitoes away for long enough for me to dive into the tent and drink beer with him. So I'm eternally grateful to Keith for that. I'm also grateful to Seed Savers Exchange for inviting me here today, which I'm slightly overawed by being the filling in a sandwich of two of my personal heroes. I mean, to hear Jack Kloppenberg this morning and to know that we're going to hear Gary Nabhan this evening, and to have me somehow bridging the gap between them is really humbling for me. And so thank you for that too. I've been trying to work out when I was last here. It wasn't the first time I was here, because I came back once, and I think that was 96 or 97. And it's wonderful to see how Seed Savers Exchange and Heritage Farm has grown and seems to be now on a really firm footing. And listening to some of the talks yesterday, I'm truly encouraged and excited by what I've seen here today, none of which would be easily possible in Europe. People don't sometimes believe me when I say that as far as agrobiodiversity goes and seed legislation, Europe has the most draconian regime of any country in the world. Now, when I say country, I mean, I'm not going to go now into the niceties of the European Union, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and all of that. Let's just say that we have these entities that are above the countries voluntarily, and that set policy and laws and regulations for all the countries that are members of the European Union. And the situation is that we have this thing called a common catalogue, and varieties of fruits and vegetables, agricultural crops, fodder seeds, oil seeds, all of that stuff, have to be registered on the common catalogue in order to be placed on the market. And placed on the market is wider than being for sale. It means exchange. It means actually probably borrowing, though we never put that fully to the test. It means that if a variety is not registered, you are not supposed to share it. Now, recently, in the past few months, there has been a reform of that legislation. And you may, if you follow these things, have seen headlines on the internet and elsewhere saying things like, new law threatens the extinction of vegetable varieties, and things like that. It ain't so. The old law did that. The new law is actually a slight improvement, in my opinion. That's the cut to the chase. If you want to have a nap now or digest your food, the rest is detail. But let's talk about the detail a bit. What I want to do today is to cover the history of this legislation and some of the consequences, some of the early attempts at reform, how we got to where we are now, and then some responses to that and my view of how and why we need to go forward with this. So to begin at the beginning, Jack Kloppenberg this morning, those of you who heard him, mentioned his book First the Seed. And the primary thing that I take away from First the Seed, and when I read it, it was a bit like the scales falling from my eyes, is that Jack makes the point very clearly that seeds are very, very interesting. And back then we didn't have self-assembling software, we didn't have nano robots that could build themselves and things like that. And seeds are kind of unique because they are the product, we eat them, and they're also the means of production. So if you have a seed, you have a choice. You can either eat the seed or the fruit it's in. I mean, let's be a little bit vague here. Or you can save that seed and grow more of whatever it is. And that's how agriculture happened. People saved the seed because they liked what they could eat from it, and they saved those seeds in order to produce more of what they could eat. And one consequence of this identity between the seed as the product and the seed as the method of production is that industry tried to break that. And that was one of the trajectories that Jack talked about this morning, is the trajectory to break the link between the seed as a product and the seed as a means of production. And what the primary outcome of that was F1 hybrids. And F1 hybrids, as you know, you can save seed from them, and it's really a rather interesting way of tapping into the vast diversity the breeding companies put into hybrids, but you have to be prepared to do some work. You can tap into an F1 hybrid, but it will not be the same as the generation whose seed you sow. And just by the by, coming down here with Sarah McCallum, we were talking, what if all the research effort that went into producing F1 hybrids had gone into mass selection of open pollinated varieties? I wonder whether all the yield advantages, even the uniformity advantages of F1 hybrids would in fact have been realized. It's one of those impossible questions to answer, but an interesting one to ask. Now, the problem with seeds, there are two problems with seeds. One is identity and one is quality. Now, quality is the kind of thing that ordinary consumer legislation ought to be able to cover. In England, we have the Consumer Protection Act, which basically says that if you buy something, it has to be fit for the purpose that you bought it for. And that means that, you know, if you buy something that doesn't work, you have a legal redress. It's a little bit tricky with seeds, partly because once you've discovered that they don't work, for example, they don't germinate, it's kind of too late. You may well, if you're a commercial farmer, even if you're a gardener, you may well have lost the opportunity. It's hard to apportion blame. You know, there are difficulties. And that's why I think a lot of the early legislation was about quality. It was about germination testing. It was about freedom from disease. It was to guarantee the quality of the seed you were buying. But then the other requirement is the identity of seeds. A seed essentially bears no relationship to the plant that's going to grow from it. One radish seed looks very much like another radish seed. Wheat seeds look very similar. There are differences, of course there are differences, but they're really hard to make use of. So when you buy a seed, you're essentially buying someone's promise that this is what they say it is. And as a result of that, and also as a result of the business of the seed being the means of production, in the early days of the seed trade, there was a lot of sharp practice. If you look through old seed catalogues, you'll find that there might be a pea called Ne Plus Ultra, a great pea, and you might find that there is also Sutton's Improved Ne Plus Ultra, which costs more and which is said to perform better. How do you know? How do you know that Sutton's did anything to improve Ne Plus Ultra? You don't. And so there was a lot of sharp practice of me selling your seeds under my name, me selling my seeds under your name because you have a good reputation, lots of sharp practice. So the very first seed legislation was about protecting the identity of seeds as far as possible. And in Europe, after the war, after the Second War, that developed into the idea of a registration system whereby a third party, an official government agency, would test the identity of variety claims and variety names. And that led to the idea of the common catalogue. So we would check that your variety was what you said it was, and if it is, we'll register it on the common catalogue, and you will have the right to multiply that seed or to maintain that seed. And essentially, there were two criteria for varieties to come onto the common catalogue. One was the so-called DUS criterion. That's D for distinct, U for uniform, and S for stable. And I'll come back to those in a minute. And the other one was VCU, which is value for cultivation and use. Now, the DUS criteria, actually not a bad idea. The D, let's get U and S out of the way. Uniform means that the plants, as they grow, must be roughly the same. And they don't have to be absolutely identical. If you've got something like an open-bred brassica, a kale or something, there's a certain range of difference in what it looks like that's acceptable. But basically, they have to be more or less uniform. And they have to be stable, which is that if you breed them in whatever the correct manner for that plant is, they will be the same in the next generation. But the D for distinctness is the thing we're really interested in here, because what it means is that if you have a variety under one name, and I have a variety that looks exactly the same under another name, they're going to treat those as somehow the same variety. Now, and that was intended to get over this idea that I can sell your seeds under my name and so on. And it's kind of a good idea, I think, to get rid of these synonyms, because the synonyms are in fact confusing. And in England, this business of getting rid of the synonyms was put in charge of the seed merchants, the seedsmen, which is a bit like putting the fox in charge of the chickens, but they were the ones who had the expertise. And so the Ministry of Agriculture organized these big grow-outs of 500 onion varieties. And the onion seedsmen would walk up and down the rows and they'd say, oh, yeah, that's the same as that one. And very often they were right. And so we got rid of a lot of synonyms. Roughly 3,000 synonyms vanished. But, as you know, sometimes things may look the same on the surface, but they're not necessarily the same under the surface, beneath the surface. And I'll just give you one example because it's one that we know about. In 1948, the Ministry of Agriculture conducted a disease resistance trial of onions. And an onion called Up to Date was the most resistant onion, was the most resistant variety to white rot, which is a pretty bad disease of onions. When the expert seedsmen wandered down the rows, they said, you know what? Up to Date is exactly the same as another variety called Bedfordshire Champion. And so Up to Date was dropped from never went onto the common catalogue. It was saved as seed, which was really interesting because in the late 1990s, mid-1990s, somebody decided to do another trial for resistance to white rot. And we had some of that Up to Date seed, and they planted it next to the Bedfordshire Champion, and they did look very similar indeed. But Up to Date was resistant, and Bedfordshire Champion was susceptible to white rot. So we we lost something when we lost that white rot susceptibility, at least for gardeners. It's around in gene banks, it's there. And who knows what else we lost. So the Common Catalogue got rid of all these synonyms and probably got rid of a whole lot of diversity as well. And it became illegal to market any unregistered varieties. And that's why, as Keith said, we had this heritage seed library. We weren't marketing them, we were lending them to you. And we skated around the law for a long time. They still are skating around the law. I don't think the ministry would ever actually want to prosecute us. And the thing about the registration is that there's a flat fee for registration. It doesn't matter whether you're going to sell 90 tons of pea seeds or 9 pounds of pea seeds. The cost to register the variety is exactly the same. And so industry, big industry, clapped its hands with glee and said, fine, we're going to register the varieties that we make a profit on. And, well, too bad about the rest. We're not interested in them. And there were objections right from the start. It was, in fact, the Common Catalogue and the loss of these varieties that led to the formation of the Heritage Seed Library. But the big seed companies didn't mind. And what they did was they persuaded gardeners that they, too, wanted industrial strength seeds. And so, staying with peas, instead of being able to grow a tall pea like Naples Ultra or Telegraph or one of the great peas, we were sold dwarf peas that were bred for absolute uniformity, which is great if you're making frozen peas. You send a pea combine through the field when the peas have optimum sugar levels and they're frozen within 3 hours and everybody's happy. Except I don't want all my peas to be ready at one time. I want to be able to walk down a row of peas, preferably standing upright rather than bending over to pick dwarf peas. And I want to be able to go down that row over a period of 3-4 weeks, picking peas when they come ripe. But I was not permitted to do that. And that's really what happened, is it removed an enormous amount of freedom of choice. I have no problem with the legislation, but it's the only legislation. And only seeds that comply with the legislation are permitted to be placed on the market. There's no alternative. Well, over a period of time, the protests gathered pace. In the early 90s, there were European parliamentary hearings that I went to, and there were conferences. And eventually, France proposed this idea of conservation mixtures and heritage varieties. And the problem with that was that they said that these had to be things that were in commerce 25 years ago. And there was going to be a one-shot attempt to create a sort of secondary list of heritage varieties. The problem with that is it gives no incentive to breeders today, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But eventually it came into force, and without going into details, if a variety was adapted to a certain place, grown at a certain low level of quantity, and more than 25 years old, it got onto a separate list. And I kind of stood back and waited for the floodgates to open and for all these land races to be registered, but they weren't. Nobody really, a few, 100 or so, but nobody really took advantage of this, partly because the fees remained in place. You still had to pay to register it, but now you could pay a slightly reduced fee for registering an older variety. And at the same time, they came up with a proposal for something that they called amateur seeds. So there were conservation seeds, and there were landrace varieties. And then there were amateur seeds. And an amateur variety was described, quote, as one with, quote, no intrinsic value for commercial production. And that's where the bureaucrats are coming from. People have said to me, how did this legislation come about? And I don't have an answer to that, but my suspicion is it came about because the bureaucrats have a misguided view of food security, which is that what we do as gardeners, small farmers, market gardeners, is irrelevant to the food supply. And that if you want food security, you have to make 2 blades of grass, 2 grains of wheat grow where 1 grew before. And that productivity is all that matters. Okay, so the conservation and amateur varieties was a bit of a dud, and the protests continued, and in 2009 another reform process started. By this time there were 90 separate laws across Europe. I should explain. One of the forms that European law takes is what's called a directive. And a directive says to countries, you must enact a law that makes these things happen or prevents these things. And then there's a regulation, and a regulation says, we have enacted a law that makes these things happen or prevents these things happening. And those, originally, the seed marketing laws were actually directives, which were then implemented in the different countries, and implemented to slightly different degrees, and implemented with slightly different amounts of stringency. So there was, in fact, a great deal of variation across Europe. And one of the things, for example, the Dutch charged ludicrously low fees for registering varieties, so they cornered the market in variety registration, because a variety registered in Holland could nevertheless be sold throughout the European Union. So there were all sorts of anomalies and 96 laws. And so another reform process started in 2009. They had 26 separate meetings of various stakeholders, and that resulted in a series of 5 options for change. The first option was no real change, except that they were going to charge the full cost of recovery. So conducting these tests, you can imagine growing out new varieties with a whole batch of old varieties to see whether the new variety was in fact distinct. That's not cheap. It's not cheap. And some countries were subsidizing it and others weren't. So the plan was everybody's got to charge the true cost of registration. Then the second option was no real change. In other words, we'll still make it completely compulsory, but we'll put the fox in charge of the chickens and allow companies to do their own testing, and we'll just believe them. The third option was complete deregulation. You don't have to register anything, but if you want to, optionally, you can register for that something is distinct, uniform, and stable, and that it has value for use and value for cultivation and use. Oh, I forgot to explain that. Value for cultivation and use means it has to be better than the existing varieties. So there's supposed to be no scope for cosmetic variation. In other words, if I'm Big Breeder 1 and you're Big Breeder 2, I can't just make mine a little different from yours, but no different really, and then market it as if it's something wonderful. Number 4 was a sort of flexible system with basic regulation of all varieties, plus higher standards if you wanted them. And number 5 was a sort of complete centralization, the 1984 option, whereby one central body would carry out all the testing, all the registration, and so on. There was actually an option on the table originally to just abandon the whole thing and have no more registration and no more quality assurance, nothing, and that was not even put to the vote. So they came up with these options, and the bureaucrats wrote a long and very interesting report. They did an internet survey, they asked for responses from stakeholders, they got 257 responses, and there was no overwhelming preference for any one of the options. By and large, the industry was perfectly happy with the current system, but they'd really rather like the opportunity to do the testing themselves. And the biodiversity types wanted no obligation to register at all. Throw the whole thing out. And the report of the process is actually, if you're into that sort of thing, which I realize very few people are, it's fascinating reading. Because the EU recognized that niche and emerging markets, they don't quite define those, were disadvantaged, and that old varieties and minor crops were gaining market share. So there was a recognition that the market was changing a little. But but the primary focus of the report was that actually the EU, taken en masse, is the single largest exporter of vegetable seeds in the world. The EU exports 60% of total global sales of vegetable seeds, and 95% of that is controlled by 5 companies. And they were the ones who were getting the legislation they wanted. In the end, though, there was a compromise between 3 of the options. So the industry is now allowed to carry out tests. There is 2-tier registration. You can go for the full DUS VCU testing, which is what industry wants, and frankly what industrial farmers want. Industrial farmers don't want to buy seeds that are the same as seeds they can get elsewhere. They don't want to buy seeds that have no value for cultivation and use. So that's fine what they want. But there is a second layer of registration now, which is based on the recognition by a central authority of an agreed description. And most interestingly of all, 2 things. First of all, the EU said gardeners are free to exchange any seed material they like. But what's a gardener? What's a CSA? What's a market gardener who sells all her produce? What's a gardener who has a glut of zucchini and instead of inviting the neighbors in and forcing them to take them away, actually goes down to the farmer's market and puts a bushel basket of zucchini? There are these gray areas which are going to be, either they're gray and we never know where we stand, or they need to be cleared up. Anyway, the big advance, though, is that they recognized what they call in Eurospeak SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and something called a micro-enterprise, and they would have access to cheaper and less stringent registration for varieties. Now, obviously, the EU's top priority is to ensure the availability of healthy, high-quality seed, and what they don't see is to the industrial sector. The rest of you can have this sort of slightly lower grade stuff if that's what you really want. And I really do think this is an advance, because we have gone from a state where if it wasn't registered, you couldn't market it, and it was expensive to register, to a state where it's less expensive to register and you can market it. So I do think that's great. A micro-enterprise is fewer than 10 people with a turnover of less than 2 billion euros, so what, $3 billion a year. I don't know how micro that is. Seems, it seems pretty reasonable to me. I'm rather surprised. The biodiversity folks, the ones who really were pushing for this, the usual suspects, they got kind of shrill, and they were the ones putting about this idea that varieties were now threatened. Varieties have been threatened long ago. I'm surprised they didn't embrace these, what I would call advances, a bit more readily. It's interesting because one of the most vociferous opponents of the old law and of the new reform actually said that they depend on their supplier relationships with larger companies. And I'm going to come back to that when I give you some ideas about how I think we should move forward. But I do think that it's worthwhile embracing this new freedom, new freedom. I think it's worthwhile embracing and pushing it as far as it can go. I mean, let's say, against the odds, that I have a micro-enterprise with 10 employees turning over 2 billion a year. That's turnover, not profit. Turning over 2 billion a year, selling tomato seeds. Could I have another company for peppers, carrots? I don't know. Nobody knows. Does the holding company have to be? There's all sorts of gray areas here. But the biggest problem really remains incentives to breeding. That's what we were hearing about this morning, and that was what I found really exciting. The EU truly thinks that intensive industrial agricultural production is the key to food security. And let me remind you, amateur varieties, right, are of no intrinsic value for commercial production. I think we face some very serious challenges. Do you think industry is going to provide for all of those? 5 companies doing the breeding? What's left of public sector breeding? Maybe, but they'll be providing for industrial agriculture. They won't be providing for gardeners. They won't be providing for small-scale people. They won't be providing for low-input people. Climate change, yeah. We're going to need to adapt our crops and methods of growing to climate change, and that's going to need new varieties. Is a small enterprise, a micro enterprise, going to have the resources for a breeding program? Again, I don't know, but I very much doubt it. And even climate change is not actually the only problem. If you take something like organic and low input growing, they have other needs. They have different needs. If you're growing organic carrots, you really rather want, or even organic wheat actually, you really rather want flat leaves growing quickly to suppress the weed growth. You don't need the upright habit that you need if you're growing industrial ones, which helps you to pull them out mechanically. If you've got a low nitrogen in the soil, you want the ability to take up nitrogen, especially when it's low in the soil. That's not necessarily what conventional farmers need. So organic growers have faced this problem in Europe that nobody is supplying them with the new varieties that they need. And I want to talk about just one study done in Brittany, in northern France. Brittany is famous for its brassicas, particularly broccoli and cauliflowers. It's a mainstay of the economy there. In fact, if any of you have traveled across the English Channel by ferry, there's a huge and wonderful ferry line called Brittany Ferries, which is great because the food's good because they're French. And that is actually an offshoot of the Brittany cauliflower and broccoli growers who actually had a need to transport their broccoli and cauliflower to England and elsewhere and set up a shipping line to do so. Anyway, in 2004, the European Union decided that organic agriculture wasn't all bad. I mean, the other thing with the European Union is there's not a great deal of joined-up thinking. So, you know, one group can say, you have to do this, and another group can say, well, it'd be nice if you did that, and the two of them. Anyway, so they decided organic agriculture would be a good thing, and they'd give some extra money to it. And the conventional growers in Normandy had been completely overtaken by F1 hybrids. Every cauliflower, every broccoli head, every calabrese head grown in Brittany was from an F1 hybrid. And the organic farmers didn't want to use F1 hybrids. They had their reasons. Quite apart from those reasons, they didn't want to be beholden to a few seed companies. They wanted a degree of autonomy, and they also wanted to explore new markets. Now, interestingly, they had a strong farmers' association. And they also had government support from a French research laboratory, the National Agricultural Research Laboratory. So they scoured around the gene banks for varieties, open-pollinated varieties that had been collected before the F1 hybrids came in the early 80s. They found 1,100 varieties. The research organization grew them out. They found huge diversity, and they found some varieties that seemed to be ideally suited to regrow under organic conditions. They had two goals, really. One was autumn cauliflowers, which had more or less vanished. And the other one was colored varieties of existing cauliflowers. So maybe you know that there are purple cauliflowers and broccoli, and there are yellow, golden cauliflowers and broccoli. They weren't available for commercial production. There weren't any F1 hybrids of them, but they thought that would be a good market niche to get into. The farmers were invited into the research association to evaluate the varieties. And while they were there, thinking, oh, this is good, this is good, this is good, and talking about where they were going to get the seed from, some of the farmers recollected that their grandparents grew cauliflowers for seed. And out of that, spontaneously, they formed something halfway between a participatory plant breeding organization and a participatory variety selection organization. And they're working with the research people. The research people make crosses. That's not so easy in brassicas. They make the crosses. They grow out the population. The farmers come in. They assess them. And then the farmers have developed seed production for themselves. Some farmers have become the seed producers for everybody. That's important for brassicas, partly because of the life cycle and partly because it's actually a more specialized job. And the interesting thing about, I mean, this is now working. The organic farmers of Brittany have now got varieties. They're breeding new varieties. They're selling into the market. There are just one problem, which is the current legislation remains a block to them. Officially, they shouldn't be exchanging the seed even among themselves. They're certainly bigger than 10 people, and they're certainly turning over more than $3 billion. So they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. It is a limitation to them. And it only works because they have an economic interest in the outcome. Participatory plant breeding, participatory variety selection works because you have an interest in what you are breeding and selecting. And that's a key to it. But the interesting thing for me is that what's happened here is that advanced organic farmers in rich northern Europe are copying exactly what's going on throughout the third world, where your tax dollars and mine are working with poor farmers to have participatory breeding programs. I mean, in Nepal, in Burkina Faso, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, I can tell, you know, there are loads of, they're very groovy in industry, in agricultural research and development for poorer countries. This is all the rage. We'll make the crosses, we'll talk to you about what you want, we won't impose on you what we think you want, we'll let you do the selection, all the rage. And finally it's coming home to Europe, and about time too. The big question is it sustainable? Can we do this? Can micro-enterprises do it? Have they got the resources? I don't think they have. And there are other examples. Wheat breeders in France are doing it, and recovering some wonderful old wheats and breeding some new wheats for bread. But these are isolated examples. And I don't know how something like the organic open source seed initiative would fare in Europe anyway, because at the end of the day, we're still not able to share the seeds the way things stand. So what would I do? Well, I think about this legislation, and I confess I have thought about it a lot. It's kind of very draconian. It removes all choice, and it stops you doing something you want to do, which is kind of like anti-drug legislation, really. And the way drug legislation has been moving is to say, personal use, okay, some drugs, some quantities, we're going to either decriminalize or we're going to turn a blind eye to them. The responses vary. But personal use seems to be something that people can accept for drugs, even if they can't accept legalizing them, and even if they can't accept the big dealers. So my suggestion is that we, in Europe, that we push for a kind of personal use exemption, that any variety that is traded exclusively in small quantities has no need for any kind of registration. I mean, small. What's a small quantity? Well, a small quantity of wheat is bigger than a small quantity of tomatoes. Obviously, we need to get that right. But I don't think that's beyond the bounds of reasonable people sitting down and talking. If you're a commercial farmer and you want to plant half an acre of a particular tomato plant, well, buy 6 packets. Why should you get a discount on wholesale? I mean, you're going to make enough money off these tomatoes anyway. So I don't have any problem with that. Or you buy 1 packet this year because you need to try it out. Is it going to work for you? And then you bulk it up. No problem with that. That's a big difference between seeds and drugs. You can bulk them up. But it also has to be exclusively sold in small packets. Because I want to get away. Most people don't understand that in Europe, 5 companies control 95% of the market in vegetable seeds. There may be 600 catalogs. They're all selling the same stuff. They're buying it in bulk and they're turning it into little packets. Does that sound like anything you're familiar with? And often they're cutting it with useless seeds. So I want to get away from the idea that the seed trade depends on bulk purchasing and breaking it down. I want to get towards an idea that establishes lots of small seed companies once again. I think it can work. It's hard work, but it's deeply rewarding, as many of you know. Okay, so you can't offer the whole range of seeds to everybody. But if you have, in a region, if you have one guy doing the squashes, a woman doing the tomatoes, another woman doing the cucumber, whatever, you create a vibrant, resilient seed economy. And that's why I think we need to embrace this legislation and move forward with it. So I think that gets around most of the problems, because with a local industry, a locally based industry, the stuff is adapted, your reputation is on the line. If my seed doesn't grow, I'm coming back to you. I know who you are, and I'm coming back to you and I'm saying, this seed was rubbish. And you can either give me a new packet or tell me to go and buy my seed somewhere else. I don't mind. So I think existing consumer legislation can handle the quality issue. What remains is the identity issue. It remains because it's the fundamental problem of seeds. You don't know what you're getting. The whole business of protecting seeds, unless you have a license that says, I'm giving this to you, but you have to give it away, the whole business of identity of the variety remains at stake. And when I first put these ideas forward, I had this harebrained scheme where when you wanted to sell a variety, you would send seeds in to a central authority and they would register that they had a sample of the seeds, and then if somebody else was growing it, you could complain and you'd go to the central authority and they'd grow it out and they'd look at it and they'd compare them and they'd judge one way or the other. We don't need that anymore. You take 100 seeds, you crush them up, you put them in a test tube and you do the DNA sequencing. We can do that now in an afternoon. So all you need to do is have a repository if you want it, and if there's any question that you have stolen my seeds, we run the DNA tests, we split the costs. And if you want to protect your variety, that's how you do it. If you don't want to protect your variety, you get one of Jack's licenses and you give it away. But I think we can move forward, take this legislation, take it as far as it'll go, embrace it, move forward, and create a diverse, vibrant, resilient seed economy in Europe. And then we can do all the other stuff we need to do. Thank you.